Hey guys and girls, it's Bravo back with another Gloomhaven terrain vid. This time we're looking at scenario 22, Temple of the Elements, which was a super fun scenario to put together. I think this one probably ties with Gloomhaven Square in terms of how fun it was to assemble. And yeah, this was a fairly big build. It took me a while. So the usual deal, guys, I'm just going to walk you through what I've done room by room. And as per usual, I will include links to all of the STL files that I've used in the video description. So the usual spoiler warnings apply. If you don't want to know about scenario 22, Temple of the Elements, stop watching now. I can tell you that some people may know I'm playing the Angry Face in our campaign. You're not going to see any Angry Face spoilers or the mini or anything like that in this video. So you don't have to worry about that. Purely layout and monster type spoilers coming up for scenario 22. Alright, so with that out of the way, let me take you through room number 1. So not a whole lot happening here, I guess, as compared to the rest of the scenario. Pretty bland. We're just looking at some floors, walls, and an entry point to the next room. So starting with the hexes. These are hexes that I've touched on in a previous video. I've only recently discovered these from Robogon. They're the overlay tiles. So as the name suggests, these hexes are designed to be overlays as per the original Thingiverse files. They're very thin, but obviously it's not an issue. You can just increase the thickness to whatever you want. So I print them to match the other hexes that I use, and they're just a nice alternative to the other hexes out there, in my opinion. The ones you're looking at there are the man-made tile version, and you'll see coming up in the next room, I also use which is another version which I also like. There's a fair bit of texture, and yeah, they just give a really good effect. So that's your hexes. In terms of the walls, they're a new print as well for me. Being a temple, I wanted to try and use something that would be temple-like, obviously, and I wanted to avoid using the stone walls that I use a lot in my other builds as a generic wall. So these ones are actually called Warhammer Ruins Modular Temple, and they're by Thingiverse user Genovan. And yeah, they're, I think, quite well themed for a temple look. I tried to paint them up to look aged, to sort of match in with the flavor text of the environment as per the scenario. So yeah, there's different wall types you'll see when you go, if you look up the link. Some of them have windows and columns, some don't, some have brickwork, some don't. So I just tried to mix up different wall types here and there for a bit of variety. And in terms of the finish, I wouldn't say it's my best paint job, but it was just a nice, quick and easy method to get them onto the table. So what I've actually done is I've primed all of these walls white, and then once the white is dry, I've gone over them with a brown wash, Agrax Earthshade. And the trick here is to put the wash on and wait a couple of minutes for that sort of transition point between when the wash is dry and when it's still wet. So after about 2 or 3 minutes, I go back over the wash with a large brush, just an old brush, and do a stippling effect with the brush. And what that actually does is, if you do it at the right time, you have the brush sort of, it pockmarks, I guess, the surface of the ruins. It sort of takes away little bits of wash here and there and just gives a very randomized effect, which is very easy to do. It's hard to get it wrong, and it gives a pretty good effect, I think. It looks quite old and aged. So it'll take a bit of trial and error. I found that when I first started trying to do it, you would either do it too soon after putting the wash down, and all you would do is move the wash around and nothing would really happen. Or if you leave it that little bit too late, obviously it's dried and it's not going to do anything. So you're just going to have a brown wash. over the surface. So yeah, just a little chip there. If it's something you want to try, it is very easy once you get the hang of it, and it's quick. I mean, you just prime it white and then do your wash and it's done. So something to consider if you're looking at doing a similar build. And then moving through to the actual entryway, I put a lot of thought into this. I wanted the entry room, the transition from the first room into the main chamber to be sort of a grand piece, or something that gave an idea of scale of walking into a big temple. So after a lot of trawling on Thingiverse, what I've actually ended up doing is, without getting too far ahead of myself, you'll see in the next room I've actually used a building print called The Tomb by Herigold. It's one of the best prints I've found off Thingiverse. I highly recommend you go and check it out. It's a free Thingiverse file, and it's a fantastic building. It's a tomb. It has 4 sides with metal sort of gates which cover the archways, and yeah, it prints well. It paints up really well, and it sort of occurred to me midway through this build that I had it sitting there on my shelf, and I thought, okay, that would be a great piece to just sort of add in to the build to give that sort of temple feel, because even though it's a tomb, it has that sort of temple look to it, I think. So you'll see coming up that I've used that off the main room, and what I've actually done is I've grabbed one of those 4 sides of the tomb and rescaled it to basically make an archway into the next room, and I've used that metal gate to put inside it, and yeah, it gives a really effective doorway, and it carries across the theme of that building in the next room to give a bit of uniformity to the look of the temple. Okay, so this is the main room, and I've continued using those same ruin walls that I've already covered, just using different variants of it, and also introducing the Archway versions, which are available from that same Thingiverse location. So I did consider doing sort of more elaborate entryways into each of the 4 elemental chambers, and for a while I wanted to theme each entrance to its respective element, but given how sort of out of control things started getting with the actual elemental chambers themselves, it was just going to take way too long. I was too keen to play this scenario with my friends to continue our campaign. So I had to make some shortcuts here and there. So I thought I'll just keep the actual entryways to each room something fairly simple. And these did a good job, and they continued that temple theme off that main room, which I was happy with. So that's the walls. In terms of the floors, again, as I mentioned earlier, these are the Robogon overlay tiles. This is the natural stone version, which is probably my favorite hex that I'm using at the moment. I love the look of them. If you make sure that you lay them out in a randomized way with different orientations, it gives a really nice effect. So I can't recommend them highly enough. You'll also notice, being a temple, I tried to think of just some little scatter pieces to fill some of the space between where the floor ends and where the walls start. So I thought I would print up some really big, grand-looking urns. So the 2 urns you can see there they're actually called Urn in Thingiverse, and they're by designer Sunny Boy. So I printed them out and just painted them up black and dry brushed some brass over the top. And yeah, I was happy with how they turned out, just for a bit of added spice to the room. Now, I'll just push the camera up a bit so you can get a bit more of an idea about the building that I mentioned earlier, which is the tomb. Okay, so as you can see, there's the tomb sitting off the end of the main room. I just put that there. As I said, I'd already printed and painted that model, so I thought, why not try and use it? And in the normal scenario, that's just a bit of wall there, but I thought it might make a nice sort of focal point for the temple. And when you go through the text, it talks about the cultists sort of standing around an artefact, which is the whole point of this scenario, as you would know. So I thought, why not make it sort of the focal point of the temple, where I could put a plinth with an artefact inside it, and have it sort of look like the cultists are gathered around it. So that's what I did. I did have an LED tea light candle, which I've used for creating the torch pillars that Robogon has, which I cover in other videos. I actually grabbed one of those tea lights and put it up inside the building and had it turned on during the actual game that we played, and it was sort of hard to tell on the video, but it gives a really nice flickering light to the inside of that building. So I definitely recommend doing that if you do end up using a building like this in your games, because it's a really easy thing to do for good effect. So I will link, I don't have the details of that, it's a goblet that I printed out and painted sort of a clay red color as per the scenario text. That's sitting on top of a plinth, which I painted up again in that brass sort of dry brush effect. And yeah, that's the artifact that the cultists are protecting. Aside from that, as you can see there's two entry points to the back two elemental rooms, being wind and frost. So there's a couple of other dressing pieces in this room, including some barrels, crates, a sword rack, which probably isn't something you'd find in a temple, but hey, it looks cool and it just filled a little bit of space around the edge, so I used it. But all of those sort of dressings are covered in my previous vids, in particular the Gloomhaven square video. So if you're interested in those, I recommend going back to that video, and I have a whole heap of links to STLs for those sort of items like barrels, boxes, crates, odds and ends. That's a really good video to check out if you want to print those sort of things. So again, I'll pause this video, I'll move the camera, and we'll get cracking on the first room. Okay, so here we have the fire room, which, man, I had fun making this room. The freedom that doing 4 elemental rooms sort of gave me in terms of theming up each area was incredibly fun to play around with. As anyone who 3D prints would know, Thingiverse is like a candy store, and being able to search through for fire or earth or frost or wind related things was a lot of fun, and really gave you a lot of poetic license to create a really unique setting for each room. So the fire one was probably my favorite in terms of the final look that I achieved. I'm still a bit of a novice when it comes to painting lava, but this was a crash course, and in the end, after a bit of trial and error, I'm pretty happy with the look that I achieved. Definitely room for improvement, but yeah, this was a lot of fun to assemble. So I guess starting with the actual entry point, and just on that you can see some dobs of blue tack there, which yeah, doesn't look great, but I wanted to magnetize the wall pieces and the archways, but as I said, I was pretty impatient to just get cracking and play the game with my friends. So I ended up just blue tacking down the wall pieces, which did the job. But yeah, obviously when you start moving bits around, you get those ugly little blue tack dobs, which when you've got a bit of OCD like I do, is annoying, but yeah, it is what it is. So I should probably just move the camera back a touch, just to show there. I've tried to theme each doorway up a little bit by putting the appropriate elemental symbol on that middle hex, which is the actual doorway tile. So I don't know how well you can see that there, but there's like a flame symbol. I found if you search Thingiverse on the different elemental shrines, there's ones for fire, earth, and I think it was wind. I don't think there was one for frost. So anyway, there was one particular floor piece that you can print out for each shrine, which has a symbol on it. So basically I just printed up or loaded up a 3-strip hex onto Cura, and I superimposed that symbol floor piece over the middle hex, rescaled it until it filled the hex, and just sat it up proud of the actual top of the hex tile to basically just put one print on top of the other in one go. So just a little thing that I did, which, I don't know, it's those little details that I really enjoy. So as I said, I've done the same for the earth and the wind room, and I couldn't find one for the frost. But yeah, just something to be aware of. If that's something that would interest you, if you're doing a similar build. And again, I'll include links to all this stuff in the final video. So moving through from the entryway, this is where I took a bit of, I guess, a departure from the actual layout in the scenario book. The actual hex configuration is the same, but usually, and from other videos that I've seen and other photos online, when people do this build, there's an altar, which I think Robogon and a few others have a cool altar that you can print out, which sits on one hex. But I sort of wanted to do it a bit grander and a bit larger, I guess. So what I actually did was I found these altar pieces, which you can see sitting in the background there, which I printed up and then printed off some steps and a raised sort of section for it to sit atop. And that's my altar essentially. So it comes off the actual hex that the altar is meant to sit on. I marked each of those hexes at the back of each elemental room so that my players knew what they had to target to attack the altar. And it just basically extends off that hex, which is one of the stairway tiles. And just thematically, the altar runs off the back of it just to give that look of, I don't know, a proper large-sized altar that I envisaged in my head when I pictured this scenario. So, you know, it's an alternative to just using one altar on a hex, and I'm happy with the look that it sort of gave me in the end. Now, sitting either side of that staircase are some braziers with some flames that were prints. They're separate prints. You print the brazier, and then I found a flame effect, which I printed as well, and painted them up and just sat the flames on top of the brazier. So again, still a bit of work to do on my flame paint jobs, but it was good enough for me. It looks a little bit like fire, I guess. So yeah, that was just another little extra effect to give that real fiery sort of look to the room. In terms of the walls, these are an open forge volcanic cavern wall from Thingiverse by designer Devin Jones, who, if you haven't checked out Devin Jones, go and have a look at his designs. They're amazing. There's a stack of them and they're all really good quality. So I definitely recommend checking him out. And yeah, these volcanic cavern walls come in straight sections and they have bends as well that you can get. So I just printed them off to straddle each side of the room and give that sort of volcanic, you know, magma sort of look to the room. So really happy with those. And finally, and probably my favorite piece, which was more sort of a craft thing than a 3D print thing, is the floor hexes. So what I've actually done here is I've just printed off flat, basic, simple hexes, as many as I needed for the room. And from there, I basically coated all of them with PVA glue and then just sprinkled a whole heap of sand over each hex. And that gives that rough sort of texture that you can see. And some of them I just did straight sand. Some I sprinkled the sand and left little craters here and there that were flat where I could paint in lava effects. And then some, before I put the sand on, I just basically cut off little random bits of extruded foam and carved into them a little bit. Just basically rubbish little pieces that I cut off a bigger block and glued them down with super glue, which are the rocks that you can see on some of those hexes. So did all of that and then started painting them. In terms of the rocky sort of rough texture look, that was just primed black, and then I hit that with the first darker shade of grey that I usually use for my dungeon dry brushing. Kept them fairly dark to try and give that ashen sort of molten look to the room. In terms of the rocks, I hit them with the first 2 levels of grey that I used for my dungeon. I didn't want to step it through to the lighter and almost white shades of grey that I usually use for my dungeons. I wanted to keep it quite dark and sort of foreboding looking for this room. So yeah, that's how I painted my rocks. And then I just found a tutorial online. I can't even remember which one in the end, but it might have been a Games Workshop tutorial on how to paint lava. And I just followed that to paint in and around the rocks and into the little pockets that I'd left on the hexes to give that final look. So yeah, really happy with how they turned out. And that finishes up the fire room. Oh, sorry, no it doesn't. Obviously you can see, looking back at you there, a fire demon or fire elemental, which is one of a pack of 4, which I actually purchased online from a designer called Printed Obsession. So if you Google Printed Obsession, really great designs, heaps of different monster minis, and that fire elemental is definitely one that I've had my eye on for quite a while, and I could finally justify buying it for a fire demon for this particular scenario. So that's where that came from. Again, I've spoiled it a little bit by painting it up. I probably should have sent it off for commission because my paint job definitely doesn't do the miniature justice, but it served a purpose for the scenario anyway. So that's where that came from, and I'll set up for the next room. Okay, on to the wind room. So again, that entranceway, you can see the little wind symbol that I've sort of superimposed over the middle hex, just to sort of identify this room as the wind chamber. And man, this room was hard. This one I struggled with the most in terms of, you know, when you're looking through Thingiverse and you want to theme up a room for an element, you know, there's heaps for fire, there's heaps for earth, there's heaps for frost. But when it comes to wind, there's actually not a lot out there that I found anyway. You know, aside from doing super cliche obvious things like putting a big windmill at the back or a wind vane or a weather vane, you know, I spent many days sort of just pondering, thinking, how could I give the look of a wind room without being, you know, without using too much of a trope. So in the end, I sort of had a brainwave. I was searching through Thingiverse and I thought, I wonder if I could find a windswept tree type look and make it look like there's a lot of wind moving through the area. So I searched Thingiverse, and what I actually found was some really great tree prints by Thingiverse user Torleaf, I think it's pronounced, and they're called Procedural Miniature Dead Tree. Now, he has a couple of versions that he's uploaded to Thingiverse. The first types I looked at were really crazy angles and were just going to be a nightmare to print in terms of having to use supports and remove them. But he does have a support-less version, a version that doesn't require supports. So that's what I ended up going with. And they're a great print. Highly recommend them. As you can see, they all are swept over in one particular orientation. Well, I obviously made sure that I orientated them to all go the same way to try and make it look like that wind really sweeps through from right to left of screen. So in sort of thinking about that and starting to print them up, I was thinking, what else could I do? And it occurred to me that, you know, sort of scattered leaves across the room would be a great look. And after a bit of an internet search, Green Stuff World actually sell like an autumn leaf litter that you can buy for hobby, which was probably a little bit more than I wanted to spend, but I couldn't find any local distributors that carried it. So I ended up ordering that from the UK. It took a while to get here, but yeah, I got that and scattered it around, and that just really put the finishing touch on the room. So really happy with how this one turned out. Especially considering how difficult I thought it was going to be to start with. So in terms of the trees, you know, it's nothing fantastic in terms of the paint job, but I was pretty happy with the look. And all it was, you know, priming them black, a really heavy brown dry brush, and then sort of a lighter beige dry brush lighter over the top of that, just to give it that sort of dead windswept look. In terms of the altar, all the altars are the same. I've just rescaled this one because the back 2 rooms of this scenario end in a 2 hex strip as opposed to a 3 hex strip like the front 2 rooms. So I had to rescale the staircases and altars to suit that smaller 2 hex width. So exactly the same model, but just rescaled. You can see my angry face marker there, which, as I said, that's just the simple way that I place something down on the staircase to designate that it's that particular hex that you have to target to damage the altar. And finally, the actual miniature. So that's again from that same 4-pack of elementals from Printed Obsession. And yeah, it's another example of my miniature painting. It looks probably more like a water elemental than a wind one or a wind demon. I keep calling them elementals, but as you would know, this scenario involves elemental demons, not actual elementals, but same difference, I guess. And sorry, the other thing is the hexes. So these are just the old bog standard hexes that I've been using for quite a while now. These ones are by Nesta on Thingiverse. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but I've linked them in previous videos if you wanted to check them out. And as I've touched on, the secret with those is if you do print them, try and be around next to the printer when they're in their final stages and stop the print before it goes right through to completion, because when it goes right through, it introduces some nasty sort of artifacting to the top of the hexes, which doesn't look great when you dry brush it. So these ones are from my good selection of hexes where I have been around to sort of cut the print slightly short and get that smoother finish to the top. All right, so there's a big gap there on the left. That's obviously, there is usually a wall piece there, but I've moved that just so you can see what's going on with the scenario. So onto the frost room. Okay, so here we have the frost room. This one involves another new technique that I'd never tried before, which is snow. So not 100% happy with how it ended up looking, but it's not bad. It's something that I'll hopefully do better the next time I attempt it. But what it basically involved was I used some of my older, crappier hexes that didn't have a great finish to the top of them. And they were my guinea pigs for trying out snow. And after reading a little bit online and watching some tutorials, I settled on using a pretty simple method, and that is to basically get a bowl and mix up equal parts of white craft paint and make sure it's a really stark, pure white. Equal parts that, equal part baking soda, and PVA glue. So PVA glue, paint, and baking soda, mix it in equal parts, and just use an old crappy brush to, mix it up and start just putting it down onto your hexes and whatever else you're putting it onto. So it was pretty easy to do, just sort of randomly stippling it around, and it gives a pretty good effect. So if you are looking at doing snow, it is definitely a nice and easy method. I think the trick is just in the application, like trying to put it down to make it look like it's a more natural formation, which I think would just come with practice. There's not a whole lot else happening in this room. I basically used, the rock walls and hexes that I've used in previous builds and just put a bit of snow on it. Obviously, we do have those crystals either side of the stairs. Those, again, are from Thingiverse. I think they might be Robogon crystals. I'm not sure. I hope I'm not getting that wrong. It could be someone else's. But in any case, I will link those crystals in the description along with all the other things that I've used. And it's a Frost Demon Mini you can see there, which is by Virtually Jason. Anyone who plays Gloomhaven and dabbles in 3D printing would well know Virtually Jason. He's done a ton of work putting monster standee replacements onto Thingiverse, amongst other things, and he does a great job with that. So thanks, Virtually Jason. That's one of your Frost Demons. Again, the same stairs and altar that I've used in the other rooms, rescaled, being a slightly narrower width. And I think that's everything in this room. So that was a quick one, and we'll move on to the Earth room. Okay, so here we have our final room, the Earth room. And again, starting with the entry, you can see I've superimposed an Earth symbol onto that middle hex. Obviously, usually there is a big ruin archway making the entry point into that room. and there's also some walls missing that I've removed from either side, just to give you guys a better look into the room at what's going on. So there's a fair bit going on in this room, quite a few different 3D print files that I've used, and also a few different hobby techniques that I've sort of used from a previous life as a wargamer, playing games like Bolt Action. So what I've actually done is, starting with the hexes, similar to the fire room, I've printed off just some blank flat surface hexes, which I have then used. I've got a really large pot of texture paint by Dulux, which for any Australian viewers would know what I'm talking about. If you go to Bunnings, you can get big 5-litre pots of texture paint, which was pretty expensive, but back when I was making a lot of foam wargaming terrain, it was well worth it because it served me well for a number of years now, and I've still got heaps left. So what I did is print off the hexes, use this texture paint, which you should be able to get at any of your local paint or hardware stores, and it's, as the name suggests, it's just a really thick paint with a grit sort of texture all the way through it. So I use that to paint onto the hexes quite thickly, and just sort of stipple it around with a brush to give random sort of effects. And when that dries and you dry brush it up with brown and beige, it just gives a nice sort of earthy look. So that's how I achieved the finish on these hexes, and I tried to sort of finish some off with heavier wash than others to give that sort of randomized light through dark effect when all the hexes are together. Once that dried, I then just used some static grass tufts that I have from various manufacturers and just glued some of those in place just to give a little bit of vegetation. So moving across from the hexes, I used the logs that Robogon has on Thingiverse just to sort of frame off the actual floor area. So they're serving as walls, I guess you could say. And I've also printed off some trees and bushes from Thingiverse, which again, Robogon files. I already had the trees printed out from a previous scenario from the Inox encampment, so I just recycled those, and I just printed off some of the bushes of various sizes as well for a bit of extra variety. The little flower tufts you can see there, again, are from just their hobby supplies that I already had. I've used them in the past for basing up my US soldiers from a World War II game called Bolt Action. So just threw a couple of them in as well for a little bit of extra spice. And yeah, we've got the same raised section and altar, which I've put a little bit of, I think it's lichen, sort of moss type hobby material. Just sort of added that to the altar to make it look a little bit overgrown. And in terms of the mini, that's a earth elemental from Thingiverse. The name of the designer escapes me at the moment, but I will make sure that's included in the video description with a link. Okay, so that wraps things up, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hopefully some of these links to the 3D print files or some of the techniques I've mentioned might help you in your next build. I'll just say this was a really fun scenario. This is probably the best one that I've played. You know, all the terrain building aside, it was just a really fun scenario to play, and just reminded me of how much I love this game, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to the next chapter in our campaign. But yeah, thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.